Human beings are territorial creatures, and they use space in particular ways. We're not the only territorial creatures on the planet, but we are the ones that are most frequently studied in political geography. And as you might imagine, territory plays a very large role in political geography because it is so easy to map. And we do frequently think of the political map of all of the territories of different states shown in different colors as sort of a quintessential representation of political geography. But when we begin a discussion of territory and the use of space in geography in general, we often begin by talking about the use of space on an individual level. We've probably all heard of this idea of personal space, and also the idea, at least, that people from different cultures have different ideas about how much space is appropriate for an individual person and what kinds of social interactions should occur at different distances from the human body. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to begin by talking about the use of space on this very personal level and then build from there. We're going to do this because we all have experience with this kind of space. Right? We want to think about how we use space in everyday life, and we all experience this and interact with personal spaces daily and manage and manipulate ours. So it's fairly common to divide personal space, broadly speaking, into a few different categories or layers depending upon the distance from the body. The first layer of space around the body is often called intimate space. And in the United States, intimate space typically ranges from the surface of the skin to about 18 inches away. Typically, Americans only feel comfortable with family, intimate partners, and, interestingly, pets entering this intimate space around them. You're probably most protective of the space about 18 inches away from your body, as far as having other people in it. You're probably very controlling of who gets that close to you. The next layer around the intimate space might be what in this terminology we'll technically call personal space. And Americans like to keep a personal space of about 4 feet that we really only let our friends and close personal acquaintances into. This distance is supposed to be a bit smaller in Europe, about 2 to 3 feet that they consider personal space. So they're comfortable being a bit closer than we are here in the United States. But then around that, you have another layer that's often called social space, where you engage with acquaintances on a social level, or you might conduct a business interaction. In the United States, again, these kinds of interactions typically take place at a range of about 4 to 10 feet. And then beyond that, you start to move into public space, which we don't typically feel threatened if other people are within. Then, as we mentioned, of course, these distances change from culture to culture. Saudi Arabia is often cited as a place where distances at which one conducts social and even business interactions happen to be much closer than we would expect. In fact, there are different pictures that you can see around of people being almost face-to-face, nose-to-nose, talking to each other with their arms around their shoulders, and what they're doing is conducting a business interaction. It's a business interaction. But that's not the range at which most people in the United States would feel comfortable conducting a business agreement. There's actually a lot of research out there on the way that people use personal space and how this differs from culture to culture. So if this is a topic that interests you, there's a tremendous amount out there on it. From there, once we have this general idea of personal space, we tend to develop protocols as a society for how to interact when we have to enter situations where the personal space rules are being violated. And an excellent example of this is people in an elevator. When you're in an elevator, we typically are can be much closer to strangers than we would otherwise stand by them if they were out in the lobby or, out in the building someplace. So it's a constricted area that we have to enter, and it violates our general norms about how close to people, especially strangers, we're supposed to be standing. So as a result, we end up with a social protocol about how we should act when we're forced into this close proximity that we're typically not okay with. So, what is the protocol for entering an elevator? You stand still, you're silent, You face the elevator door. You ignore everyone. Sometimes look down, count your feet. When you get to 2, start over. If somebody isn't following this particular protocol for this violation of personal space in the elevator, it can be very disruptive or upsetting. Think about someone who routinely approaches you in open areas and stands only a few inches away from you. Likewise, what if somebody tries to strike up a conversation with you or is doing something very active in the middle of an elevator that may make you uncomfortable, or their simple fact that they're doing that may make you uncomfortable, even if you would have no problem with what they were doing if they were standing 4 feet away from you, in the lobby or something like that, or 12 feet away from you in the lobby. There are different social experiments that you can find where people do strange things in an elevator, or what are strange things because the space is so highly controlled because of social space, and you can see how people react. What if you walked into an elevator and instead of facing the door, you just turned around and looked at everybody in the elevator? You turned the other way. Well, that's a breach of the elevator protocol and probably is going to make people feel very uncomfortable. There was also a famous Candid camera experiment where people tried to get people to bend to social pressure by turning different directions in elevators. And it works because that's such a highly regulated space, because we're in close proximity to people that we ordinarily would not be in close proximity to. I just recently encountered another situation, and I was thinking about personal space because I had been developing this lecture. And this was when I was walking along the bike path in my community. And of course there are lots of bikers and also walkers also on the path. And so I thought about the use of space on the bike path. And it seems to be the case that social protocol is that you greet the person saying hello or good morning or good afternoon who is also on the path with you, particularly if they're approaching you. Clearly you see the person coming, but you don't say hi or good morning to them when they're 30 or 50 feet out. When do you acknowledge their presence and greet them? And I was trying to do, rough estimations of the distance there, and I think that it's about at when the person begins to enter social space. As long as they're outside of what we would consider social space in that public area, we don't greet them. But then as soon as they begin to enter social space, that's when we acknowledge the other person's presence, exchange a greeting, and then move on. And then probably, I think the situation at least the bike path that I was on, it's wide enough so that most of the time people never have to get in each other's personal space, that area that's inside social space. So it seems like our protocol for greeting people on the bike path involves our sense of social space. Another example, consider your behavior on a bus. Many universities use buses for public transportation to get around campus, and this is probably another situation where you're going to be required to get closer to other people than you would if you were all standing around in the park or on the quad, or even if you invited them all over to dinner. Therefore, the buses also become a highly socially regulated space where we establish all of these social protocols because the proximity to each other is much closer than we would otherwise be comfortable with. So think about the social protocols for an overcrowded bus. It's probably to sit or stand still, reduce the amount of space that we personally occupy, trying not to touch anybody if at all possible. Sometimes you can't help it when people are packed on. But if you can, the first thing you do is try not to touch anyone. We may not even want to look at other people. I mean, do you really look at other people, look at them in the eye and so forth when you're sitting there at the bus? Probably not. So how do you feel if somebody is breaking one of these social protocols regarding how you operate on a crowded bus? We should also note that culturally there are different norms regarding personal space relative to one's gender. There may be different protocols for what the acceptable distance is between a man and a woman as opposed to a man and another man or a woman and another woman. You can also encounter this on a crowded bus, even here in the United States. When I was sitting on an overcrowded campus bus, there was a female college student who was sitting in the seat right beside me. So of course, following sort of the social protocol for this situation, she refrained from acknowledging my presence, touching me, looking at me, anything like that. And then when the bus cleared out a little bit, then she got up in order to increase the space between us and sat down in the seat directly opposite from me across, on the bus. So at that time, then we sort of relax how much space we're controlling. Arms, legs probably take up a little bit more space now that there's no one around us. And we're probably a bit more comfortable as far as social spaces. And it was at that point that she asked me a question about a book that was sitting in my lap. Okay? I bet that she would never have asked that question had she still had to be sitting right next to me on the crowded bus. Okay, so why did she feel comfortable asking me a question when sitting across from me and not when sitting right next to me? It has to do with the use of space. Together, when we were sitting right next to each other, we would have been in what would be traditionally considered our intimate space. She's closer than 18 inches to me. I'm closer than 18 inches to her. And so our actions, by being this close, will probably give some sort of hint as to the relationship that she and I had. And we had none, of course. We were complete strangers. So she wanted to make sure that everybody on the bus knew that we were not intimate partners. Probably by being this close and by talking to me, it would have given the impression that she was comfortable being within that distance of me and therefore implied a sexual or intimate relationship between us, which she didn't want to do. But then once she moved to the other side of the bus and we were then within range of just social conversation, then she felt comfortable asking the question, because the question wouldn't imply any type of relationship when posed outside of that intimate distance. Think about other social protocols about space. Think about situations that are public areas and there's a lot of opportunity for people to sit down and occupy some location. Perhaps it's the large open area at the airport terminal where everyone is waiting to get onto a plane, or maybe it's the study area of a university library where there are all these tables and chairs. If you're the first person who comes in to sit in that area, then you have your choice of places to sit. But then we'd probably think that it would be very, very awkward if when a second person entered this space, they decided to sit in the seat that was exactly next to you. Unless, of course, you knew this person or they were your friend. This would be a breach of social protocol regarding the use of space. So we seem to have this general rule that in the event that you're in a public area and there are lots of places to occupy, then you should spread out. It's only after more people begin arriving and it's not possible to spread out anymore, and yet we all have to be in this particular area, that we start to fill in all of the seats in between. I was once in a class where we were discussing this phenomenon specifically regarding restroom etiquette. You can see different protocols for use of space within restrooms as well. For instance, guys have a social protocol about using urinals in the restrooms, and as I understand it from these conversations, women have a similar protocol about the use of stalls. So if you're in a restroom that has like multiple urinals or multiple stalls, and one of them is already occupied, it would seem very strange for one person to come in after you and start to use the one that is right next to you. Okay, generally, social protocol in this situation suggests that you use the one that is farthest away from the one that's already in use, and so you spread out. In certain situations, this rule is violated. There can be situations where more people need to use the restroom than there are urinals or stalls. Think about when a movie gets out, everyone goes to the restrooms, or maybe halftime at a football game, where the restrooms are packed. And so in this case, we have to tolerate being closer to one another. But think again, what is the behavior, what is the social protocol when you have to, say, use urinals that are right next to each other in a packed restroom or stalls? It's probably different. That again becomes regulated because of the social use of space. Again, it somewhat follows the procedure for elevators and buses. You probably do not even try to acknowledge the presence of the other person, stand relatively still, don't make a whole lot of noise, don't occupy too much space, and then leave. Even though when you think of territory, you might think about states and political territory or gang territory or the territory of groups of people, it's also the case that individual people claim territory. in a sense, and they do this even in areas that might otherwise be considered a public space. Of course, we have our homes, but even in public spaces, people tend to claim particular spaces for their use. And you see this all the time when you're going to class. Students frequently choose a desk, chair, or workstation in a classroom, sometimes on the very first day of the class, very often on the very first day of the class, and then stay there for the remainder of the course. And so they actually, in a sense, claim territory by the repeated use of that chair, that desk, that workstation. At least ownership or territorial claim for the purposes of that class period, even if at that moment that they don't have an item of theirs sitting on that particular desk trying to claim space. When you come in for a particular class, everyone has their little territory that they go to and feel comfortable in. And you know that it is a comfort sort of thing, because have you ever been in a situation where you've been repeatedly using a desk or sitting in a chair in a particular classroom, maybe for several weeks, and then maybe one day you come in and someone else is sitting in that place? Well, how did it make you feel? You may have felt rather violated. There was a territorial violation here. It may have very well made you feel like someone else is in your space. Even though technically it's just a chair in a classroom and there are many others like it, and we don't technically have a strict territorial claim on that chair, we certainly do have that social protocol about that use of space. Through repeated use, you're sort of claiming it as your own. And I've even seen circumstances where students have been fighting a sort of war over the chair by getting to the classroom increasingly early to sit in and claim that chair. So it seems like our protocol on this is that if you'd like to change seats during the course of a class, then you're welcome to do so as long as you choose a chair that was not otherwise regularly occupied by another person. Taking that chair that they regularly occupy is a kind of territorial violation for them. Further, you might think about the way that space is used in a variety of social situations, especially in those that are supposed to invoke some sense of power relationship between people. For instance, when sitting at a very long table, we associate the ends of the table, the head of the table, as being the position of power. Sometimes it's significant whether or not someone is sitting on the left or the right of someone else. Sitting across from someone else at the table can invoke or imply a confrontational or competitive nature between those two separate sides, such as when you're undergoing some kind of intense business negotiation. The two sides may be on the other sides of the table. But by sitting next to someone, that may imply friendship or at least non-hostility between those two types of people. These sorts of rules regarding use of space can be very formalized, much more than just our general social protocols that we'd been talking about earlier. But many times in these situations, use of space is highly formalized and must be followed, or else risk insult to one or more parties involved. So why talk about this? How is this relevant to geography? Well, first of all, of course, admittedly, personal space may not immediately qualify as being particularly geographic, or at least may not seem so, especially if you're using admittedly vague definition I gave in the What is Geography lecture. This is where I distinguish between things that are geographic and things that are merely spatial. So clearly, all of the things that we have been talking about with the use of personal space are spatial. Well, first of all, there are certainly people in geography who do study this. They become very interested in this use of space at a personal level. But more broadly, when moving toward a discussion of politics, global politics even, we like to ground the understanding of use of space in something immediately personal. Okay, so if individually we do this, if individually we have these social protocols, individually we use space in different ways, then once groups begin to aggregate, once people begin to aggregate into groups, we then sort of have this progression from personal spaces into group spaces, and the way we use those, whether the group feels violated or not, what are protocols for use of this space among groups. And so it is a transition, a very natural feeling transition from talking about individual use of space to group use of space at a variety of different levels.